Hi, I'm Jarrett Murphy from City Limits, and I'm in the City and State video studio with Joe Strasbourg, the long-term president of the Rent Stabilization Association, which has 25,000 members, property owners, and managers.
That's correct.
The mayor's State of the City speech recently, he talked about his housing plans, and he also talked about landlords. He referred to slumlords and predatory landlords. Do you think those exist in the city? Are they a problem? And what do you think of how the city has and is planning to deal with them?
Well, clearly we do have some rotten apples, just like there are in every other entity that exists in the city or state. And when those are recognized, we need to deal with that issue so that we can't protect them, nor do we protect those who violate the law. We believe that there are rules that you have to follow. And if you violate it, and if you're a slumlord, then we as an organization will not support you. And in fact, you know, there used to be a time they would always list the top 10 worst landlords, and in the last 10, 15 years, and I'm proud to say that very few times would you ever find that they were members of RSA. We try to have the traditional owners of property, the mamas and papas who've been around a very long time. And unfortunately, some of the problems is that you do have people who have come to New York and invest who are not committed to preserving affordable housing, but are looking for a quick buck in terms of return on their investment. And those are the ones who are the most problematic. But they don't represent the majority of the owners of the city of New York. And I think it's unfortunate. Sometimes it's very easy to demonize the entire industry. And I think the mayor has to be very careful how he pinpoints and goes after those who, in fact, are the most egregious in terms of how they deal with their tenants.
Mm-hmm. Most of the mayor's speech was about his plan to increase affordability in the city, and the premise for that, obviously, is that there's an affordability crisis. Do you agree? Is there an affordability crisis in New York?
I think that New York is no different than any other city in the country. I mean, clearly the cost of operating buildings, especially in the city of New York, where the average home or apartment building is 70 years or more, requires a lot more resources to maintain. The issue of income has never caught up, has never increased sufficiently enough, so there are always going to be those who are going to be paying more than 1/3 of their income towards rent. And I believe that if you really want to deal with the issue of affordability, well, let me first comment about the mayor's hope to create more housing, affordable housing in the city of New York. At least I commend him for doing something that others have talked about and never have accomplished. They've always done the rhetoric. Here he's clearly would like to see that occur. Our problems with the way he's doing it is that as you attempt to preserve rather than create affordable housing, his position on the Rent Guidelines Board, where he made it very clear that owners don't deserve increases, he wanted to do a rent freeze, when in fact the cost of operating these buildings, at least last year, was in excess of 3%, and water and sewer rates were increased under this administration. You can't ignore the fact that to operate a building, you need a cash flow. You need to be able to pay the real estate taxes and other expenses, maintain the building infrastructure. So if you're going to want to preserve affordable housing in the city of New York, whether you like it or not as a progressive, you need to be able to provide the owners with the cash flow in order to pay those expenses. And I think that if he continues in this part of his rhetoric, and sometimes I believe he's still campaigning for mayor, but if he continues to implement that rhetoric and advocate for zero or very low increases, then the entire affordable housing stock in the city of New York becomes at risk. And we're talking about, as I said to you, those housing units outside of Manhattan that were found in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and in Queens. And I think that there's a true danger. And so if he's attempting to tackle the issue of affordability, then I think we need to look at other policy considerations. One of the things that we've always advocated is that, not that the courts have argued that rent stabilization really is a public benefit, and when you have a public benefit, you shouldn't have private industry completely shouldering the burden of that responsibility. So we are going to advocate a form of what we call a SCREE program. This is a program, but much broader in essence. What SCREE is when you're a senior citizen and you pay more than 1/3 of your income and you have certain income limitations. What occurs is you have the tenant is protected from future increases. the difference between those future increases is then applied as a credit against the owner's real estate taxes. And so, in essence, if you really want to provide a safety net for those who are paying more than 50% of their income towards rents, you want to create a safety net whereby then it's us as a society, government, then shares the burden among us all. And I think that's where he is deficient and he falls flat on, because otherwise the number of units that are preserved will gradually deteriorate. And as it is right now, approximately 10% are red flagged by the Department of Finance of those owners and buildings that can't even, at this moment, provide the income to pay for their real estate taxes or water and sewer taxes.
One of the areas where that clash between landlord costs and tenants' ability to pay is kind of manifest every day is the city's housing courts. And there's been a movement this year to provide counsel to more tenants in housing court, and some would say even provide a general right to counsel, similar as exists in criminal court. Do you support that?
Actually, 2.5 years ago, I know it may come as a surprise to many people who are probably watching this, but Judge Lippman, who is the Chief Justice of the Court of Appeals, held a forum in Manhattan where I had the privilege of being asked to testify. And that specific question was actually asked, and we embraced it. We understand that sometimes there's a need to have justice. You need to have the tenant understand what they're signing on to. I think right now that the practices of doing quick dispositions in the corridors doesn't really help justice for both sides, because what happens is that tenants subsequently come in and say, I didn't know what I was signing, and they reopen the case, and then you create an even further backlog. It is our belief that having counsel representing the tenant when you have a final disposition, whether it's a written agreement or a final submission for eviction or non-payment, that it helps the process move forward, because everybody understands that they had their day in court, and that's what you really should have is your day in court to make your case. And once there's a conclusion, then you need to remove that off the docket and let the next case come before you, because there are a lot of people online who sometimes, because of the delay, never get their fair hearing in court.
We've talked about the mayor, we've talked about courts, but obviously all eyes this year in terms of housing policy are on Albany and the question about how to renew and whether to renew rent regulations. How do you feel the change in leadership in the Assembly affects that debate at all? Do you see an impact?
I see none whatsoever. I think that it's clear that when you have a downstate speaker, that rent regulation, especially when you have over a million rent-stabilized tenants, is an issue that they have to deal with. And clearly, when we recognized that there was going to be a downstate speaker by the name of Carl Hastie from the Bronx, we recognized that the policy consideration of keeping rent stabilization was going to happen. And especially since you also have a governor who supports the concept of continuation of rent stabilization. I am hopeful that this new speaker is willing to have a substantive discussion on the issue of rent stabilization. Historically, no one cares about how to change a 70-year-old system that doesn't really work. We keep on rubber stamping it and extending it without really significant policy changes on it. What do I mean by that? You have the rhetoric of, we don't want it as owners because we believe it's a taking. Tenants believe it's critical in terms of maintaining a roof over their head. But no one is prepared to tackle the third rail of politics, and that is, why are we protecting apartments? We should be protecting tenants, not apartments. And so if we're going to have a true dialogue about if the law continues to exist in the city of New York, it makes better sense from our perspective to protect those who need a safety net, not those who have a second home in the Hamptons or upstate New York, because it's really egregious that you have people who are exceeding certain income thresholds who are protected and have a second home or have a place in Florida. And those are protected because nobody's willing to change the way the law applies to entities or categories versus across the board. And that to us is really the level of frustration, and we hope And we don't even know whether we'll have that opportunity to have that dialogue with the new speaker, because clearly he's going in totally overwhelmed. He's got to deal with the state budget right off the front, and then there's so many other issues. And had he had the ability to have been speaker for a couple of years, I believe that we would have had an opportunity at least to have a real dialogue.
Mm-hmm. One impression that a lot of tenant advocates and some housing experts have is that actually RSA and landlords and property owners would be fairly happy with the perpetuation of the status quo. Their belief is that the rent stabilization system as it exists now, because of vacancy decontrol, kind of contains the seeds of its own destruction or erosion. What do you say to that characterization?
Well, listen, I think that the whole purpose of Rent Stabilization Association being in existence is to totally eliminate rent stabilization. In other words, for those tenant advocates who don't like me, why don't you support our position, and then I'll be unemployed and I'll leave. But the reality, there is a reality, and the reality is that you have to understand New York City is probably the last bastion of large, it's the application of rent stabilization in terms of a larger kind of component. Every other city has, even those that still have some form of rent stabilization. If you look at California, they have vacancy decontrol, recontrol. We don't have that. What we have is a hybrid of that, whereby only those in Manhattan who are fortunate to be able to get above a certain rent level are able to be decontrolled. So that's why you still have almost 1 million rent stabilized units in the city of New York, because those outside of Manhattan can never get out of there based on how they move the goalposts. So, so again, I challenge the tenant advocacy group that if you think we're happy, then try to make us unhappy.
So last question, I was at a NYCHA hearing yesterday talking about a plan to sell some Section 8 buildings off. And the fallback position, the safeguard that they were providing, was that in 30 years' time, when the deal is lapsed, that the apartments will go into the rent stabilization system. But the question people asked was, well, will there be a rent stabilization system in 30 years? What's your bet? Do you think we'll still be having this conversation or some version of it in 3 decades? Or?
I hope I'm not here to have a conversation with you on that subject matter. But my feeling, if I was going to forecast, is that it would take a Herculean effort on the part of maybe a different governor, and if the world changed significantly politically up in Albany. But the likelihood of that occurring, and then people forget actually that rent stabilization was really more of a creature of a Republican administration rather than a Democratic administration. And the likelihood of there being both houses Republican and the governor at the same time being Republican is I think the odds are better for me to win today's lotto drawing of $480 million. So having said that, I truly believe whoever's going to be sitting in this chair, it will be a younger version of me, but we will still be debating the issue of the merits of rent stabilizations in the state and city of New York.
Well, you've got a lottery ticket to buy, so we'll let you go. Thank you very much.
And if I do, you won't see me again for a while. Thank you.